Hello everyone, and welcome to Capitol Watch for Friday, May 9th, our weekly look at the Missouri General Assembly. And joining us from our governmental relations offices in Jefferson City is our Associate Executive Director for Advocacy and our Chief Lobbyist, Mike Reed. And Mike, one of the big events, of course, of the past week was the override of Governor Nixon's veto of the state income tax cut bill. Tell us about that.
Yes, that was the big news of this week, that and the budget. The override came on Monday and Tuesday morning. It will be interesting to see what happens now. This bill goes into effect in 2017. It is a gradual going into effect. There are certain triggers in it that growth has to be at least $150 million over the net growth over the previous 3 years of money. We're going to have to see where this goes. It's questionable. Districts are going to have to keep a watch to make sure that that we still receive the amount of money that we are supposed to. The most important thing we have always said is please fund the formula first. Before we do tax cuts, let's fund the formula first. So it will be an opportunity for the General Assembly in the next 2 years to fully fund the formula, and we're going to work very hard with them to see that they do that.
And speaking of funding, Mike, as you mentioned, the state budget was passed by the General Assembly this week. What does it look like for school funding for the coming fiscal year?
Well, it was an interesting way to pass the budget. The budget was passed, and we did receive an increase of approximately $116 million over the previous year. There is a possibility we can even receive more money than that if, in fact, revenue growth comes in as the governor has hoped it would. So there are two tiers that we could reach. Hopefully, we'll reach the higher one, but at least we will reach the lower one. It is an increase in money. It doesn't fully fund the formula, but we are very appreciative of that fact. Plus, we received an increase in transportation money and more money for pre-K education. So there are some very good parts of this budget. We appreciate the hard work of the Budget Committee in giving students more money and trying to reach the goals that had previously been set for them.
But as you said, Mike, from a budgeting standpoint, school districts probably should count on the $115 or $16 million increase and not necessarily that additional money that might become available. Is that right?
That is correct. I would budget with the lower figure in mind. I think that's the most prudent and conservative way to do it. And at the end, if we get the extra, that's even better for the next year.
Mm-hmm. Another issue we've been following, of course, this session, Mike, is the legislation related to unaccredited school districts and state intervention in those districts, as well as changes to the student transfer law. And we now have two versions of that bill. The General Assembly is trying to get together and work out the differences. Where do we stand on all that?
That's in a conference committee right now, and the conferees are trying to find some common ground. And it's really very difficult. The House has certain ideas. The Senate has some other ideas. There's a question about how much money should follow the student and what is the district's obligation, the sending districts and the receiving districts, who pays for transportation, as well as numerous other things. Right now they're quite far apart. Perhaps over the weekend they will get together a little bit more, but the conference committee report is not even drafted yet, and it will be sometime in the middle of the next week before we see if there is any sort of agreement on this piece of legislation.
And one of the provisions we've been concerned about in that piece of legislation, Mike, is what's called the private option, or what is essentially a voucher provision. Is that still in there right now? That
is still in there right now. This is the private option, and there are some people who are very, very adamant that the private option stays in. What we believe is a voucher. What it is public money going to private schools. That is a complete and radical change in ideas for school funding in school operation in this state. But public money going to private schools is not in our resolutions. We are against changes such as that, and we will work very hard to see that that does not happen.
Another issue in conference, Mike, has to do with Common Core, those standards, and possibly some revisions to those standards. Where does all that stand?
Yes, the Common Core bill is also in conference committee, and that conference committee is pretty well reached some agreements on that. It appears that there will be a new group put together to be an advisory group to look at the standards and to develop Missouri standards. Now, that does not mean that the Missouri standards cannot contain much of what's in the Common Core presently, but it is going back and looking at standards again, and we will be developing our own standards in the next several years. And it was a compromise on everyone on all sides of this piece of legislation. It appears to be moving rather quickly and should be passed by the end of next week.
Another bill that reached the governor's desk this week, Mike, has to do with religious freedom for students in schools. Tell us about that bill.
Yes, that's Representative Elijah Harr's bill. Representative Harr is out of Springfield. He perceived a problem with students and being able to exercise religious freedoms in various districts. I believe that we have that covered in the policies that we presently have in place. However, this just reemphasizes the fact that we must have policies in place to allow students to exercise religious freedom at certain points in time, but not be disruptive. Again, we have those policies in place, and we will keep continuing to write policies and procedures that follow the state law. But this is a bill that probably will be signed by the governor in the next few weeks.
All right, Mike, 1 week left in our current session, and the final week of a General Assembly session can often be quite chaotic, and lots of things to follow, and we could see amendments added to bills, so a lot to keep an eye on, isn't there?
Oh yes, this is the time that they call the Christmas tree time, where all kinds of amendments go on bills which may or may not have anything to do with the bills. So we will be very careful in reading all of the amendments. Many amendments are put on, some of which have never even had a discussion before, but will be thrown onto a piece of legislation. So it is a time for a lot of reading, and as you said, there's a little chaos that goes on, but we will keep our members informed of what is happening and what is not happening. We may send out several alerts to let your representatives and senators know how these various amendments are affecting you and how you operate the local public schools, how that affects children.
All right, Mike Reed, thanks a lot for joining us, as always, on our Capitol Watch program. And as Mike mentioned, during the final week of the session, we'll be keeping you up to date on what's going on, possibly through critical issue alerts. We will not be having our Legislative Voice next Friday, but our next edition of Legislative Voice will be a wrap-up edition, and also a wrap-up edition of Capitol Watch following the adjournment of the session next Friday. Thanks a lot for joining us on this edition of MSBA's Capitol Watch.